I'm Tom Putnam, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. And on behalf of Tom McNaught, Executive Director of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all of my library and foundation colleagues, I thank you for joining us this evening. Let me begin by acknowledging the generous underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, including lead sponsor Bank of America, Boston Capital, the Lowell Institute, Raytheon, the Boston Foundations, and our media partners, the Boston Globe, WBUR, and NECM. We're thrilled to welcome such a large audience and diverse panel to help us mark the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Peace Corps. As you may know, many credit the genesis of the founding of the Peace Corps to a moment during the 1960 campaign. After debating Richard Nixon, then Senator John F. Kennedy traveled from New York to the University of Michigan. Hundreds of students braved the cold to greet him on campus. Let's watch a brief video.
Doctors are willing to spend your days in Ghana, technicians or engineers? How many of you are willing to work in the Foreign Service and spend your lives traveling around the world? And I think Americans are willing to contribute, but the effort must be far greater than we've ever made in the past.
In his inaugural address, President Kennedy famously asked all of us to serve our country, stating that the trumpet summons us again to bear the burden of a long twilight struggle against the common enemies of man, tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself. And from that summons came the Peace Corps, not created by John F. Kennedy, Sergeant Schreiber, or some executive order, but by the few hundred men and women who were the first to go into the field in 1961, followed in turn by tens of thousands of others, including those of us here with us this evening. Before introducing each of our speakers, let me say that Senator Christopher Dodd is unable to join us this evening as there's been a death in his family, but he asked me to convey his continuing enthusiasm and support for the Peace Corps, in which he served for 2 years, beginning in 1966. He and his family recently returned to the village in the Dominican Republic, where the street in front of the school he helped build was named after him. Here are our speakers. I'll do them in alphabetical order. Sarah Chase served in Morocco from 1984 to 1986. A former NPR reporter, she left journalism to help build a stronger civil society in Afghanistan, where she currently runs a soap factory. I should note that both of her parents served in the Kennedy administration, and her mother, Antonia Chase, is here with us this evening. Elaine Jones was one of the first African-American volunteers serving in Turkey from 1965 to 67. A prominent civil rights attorney and activist, she was the first female president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She is also a member of the Kennedy Library Foundation's Profile and Courage Committee. Joseph Kennedy III served in the Dominican Republic from 1984 to 1986. The grandson of Robert F. Kennedy, he serves as an assistant district attorney in Barnstable County. We're honored to have him here with us today, linking us directly to the Kennedy family's legendary legacy of public service. I'd also like to acknowledge Vicki Kennedy, who is here with us this evening. You always honor us with your presence. And I should mention that former Congressman Bart Stupek, And former Congressman Bart Stupek, himself a profile in courage, is also here with us this evening, Congressman Stupek. A native of Medford and a graduate of UMass Amherst, in 1963, Paul Thoreau served as a Peace Corps volunteer in what would become Malawi. His service was slightly short-lived, though. He was asked to leave the country in his final month of service for befriending forces opposed to the governing dictator. He then moved to Uganda to teach English and become a friend to the novelist V.S. Naipaul. He's one of the world's most recognized travel writers and novelists, having written such bestsellers as The Great Railway Bazaar, By Train Through Asia, and the novel The Mosquito Coast. Our moderator, Stanley Miser, has just written When the World Calls, the inside story of the Peace Corps in its first 50 years. He was the Deputy Director of the Peace Corps' Office of Evaluation and Research in its early years, and he will be signing books, which are available in our museum store after the forum. How refreshing it is to recall that moment 50 years ago when public service was valued as the very best a citizen can offer his or her country, in contrast to these days when the rights of those who work in the public sector are under attack. Please join me in welcoming to the Kennedy Library Sarah Chase, Elaine Jones, Joseph Kennedy III, Paul Thoreau, and Stanley Miser.
Well, I thought I would start by setting the historical tone just briefly, because in the first years of the Peace Corps was a national phenomenon. It was front-page news all over the United States. The director, Sergeant Shriver, who was President Kennedy's brother-in-law, charmed every Washington correspondent and every member of Congress, with the exception of 2 or 3, and he made the cover of Time magazine. It was such a phenomenon that the New Yorker devoted a half-dozen cartoons to it in the first year. The New York Times published the names of the first volunteers as if they had won Guggenheim Fellowships or at least MacArthur Genius Awards. The Peace Corps was considered different, and it was something special in the United States government. Now, I found out how different it was on my first day of work. 5:45 p.m. was the government leaving time then, and at 5:45 p.m. on my first day, I started to leave my office, and then noticed that no one else in the evaluation division of the Peace Corps was leaving. So I went to the my neighbor, who was Dick Richter, who became the managing editor of ABC Nightly News later. I asked him what was going on, and he told me everybody at the Peace Corps wants to show commitment. They work late at night, and they come in on Saturday to show that they really are committed to the Peace Corps. But I told him I had finished my work and I was going home. And he said, well, he was too. And so the two of us stood in front of the elevators when suddenly our boss, Charlie Peters, who became the founding editor of the Washington Monthly, he spotted us and bellowed out, what do you two guys think this is? The Department of Agriculture? Well, in the next 50 years, the question is, did the Peace Corps become the Department of Agriculture, or did it remain dynamic and special? And I'm hoping our panelists are going to tell us that tonight. But I thought we would begin in the order of their service. If each of the former volunteers, returned volunteers, would tell us what exactly they did in the Peace Corps, and what their job was, and also whether they felt they were successful in their work. And I thought therefore we'd start with Paul, because he reached Malawi, I guess Nyasaland in those days, in 1963.
Okay, yes. I was in a group called Nyasaland 3. In 1963, I graduated from UMass, and I really had no clue. I didn't know what was awaiting me. I had heard the presidential, the inaugural address, ask not what your country can do for you. But really what was on my mind was I was wondering what my place in the world was. And the choices were, I could join the army, I could go to graduate school. I didn't have a clue. So I joined the Peace Corps. I had fuzzy ideals. I'm from here, you know, or as we say in Boston, here. I'm fed up to here. And I really was wondering what my role was, where I was going. So I joined the Peace Corps, I went to Malawi, and it was before independence. It was called Nyasaland then. And I realized how small I was. And I may say that in 1963, some of you may recall, voter registration was going on in Mississippi, and very few voters were being registered. The police were stopping them. The March on Selma was a few years ahead. There was a tremendous sense of injustice, and or wondering what the government was doing about voter registration, about segregation, about the war in Vietnam, and about nuclear testing in the Pacific. All of those were on our mind. And I felt, in joining the Peace Corps, I had a perspective on who I was as an American. People were constantly asking me questions in Nyasaland, as it was. What are you doing, say, in terms of segregation? Very little, as a matter of fact. Nuclear testing, very little. And I realized I was small, and I had to be humble, and I had to have answers. And I didn't have all the answers. So, to answer Stanley's question, I taught in a bush school in the southern part of Malawi, as it became. I had the Peace Corps taught us the language. I still speak the language. I run into Malawians in elevators, and I can say, "Ukaipa nkope tiwa nyimbo." If your face is ugly, learn to sing. And I met some in India. So a cassette went into my brain, and I taught in the school. I became headmaster of the school. People were upwardly mobile then. The headmaster of our school became ambassador to the United States. And that's how, when Tom was introducing me, I was deselected or terminated early from the Peace Corps because the Peace Corps said, get involved, learn the language. I learned the language. I became involved with people who were anti-government. Made the right friends, I would have thought the wrong friends. And it was a plot to overthrow the government when I was unwittingly involved in it and left and went to Uganda. But they said that when I was terminated from the Peace Corps, I had the distinct honor of being told, when I was debriefed in Washington, I was brought to the Undersecretary of State for African Affairs, a man called Jesse McKnight, who had a group of men, and he said, we want to ask you questions about Malawi. And for 2 hours, I was in the State Department, in the Pentagon, talking to high-ups in the State Department. And the last question they asked me was, when's the lid going to blow off? And I said, you know, none of your diplomats speaks Chinyanja. I do. I said, you really should teach them language, send them into the bush, and they'll know when the lid's going to blow off. And then I felt, I knew no more than they did, but I was in the bush and trying to be humble. And what the Peace Corps taught me actually was humility, and what a small role I had in the country and in the world.
But the other part of the question, did you feel you were a good teacher?
I was a good teacher, but in 1963 we had a teacher training program. We were training teachers, and I thought, in the fullness of time, 5 or 6 years, Malawians will be teachers. They'll have enough teachers, and we will have fulfilled our service. I felt I was a good teacher, and the school was a model school, but 40-odd years later, 45 years later, there are still Peace Corps volunteers, still training teachers, and many of the teachers have left. They work for NGOs, and teaching is a despised profession, as it is. You know how teachers are regarded. In Providence, Rhode Island, they were all fired yesterday or the day before. In Malawi, there are still people training to be teachers. And I wonder, I was enriched by the Peace Corps, enriched by being there. Malawi still has Peace Corps people and doesn't have enough teachers. So I felt I did, but the Malawi, we somehow, the spirit of volunteerism wasn't inspired in that country. People in Malawi did not become volunteers. And so I felt, to a certain degree, we failed.
Okay, let me go to Elaine, who came to Turkey in 1965.
Elaine, how did you end up in Turkey in 1965? You know, I'm still answering that question. I had come out of the segregated South from Norfolk, Virginia. And so I knew all about the back of the buses and all of that. I mean, I did that. I knew that. And I graduated from Howard University in 1965. My graduation speaker gave the Great Society speech. The Great Society speech was at my graduation by Lyndon Johnson. And President Kennedy, I had heard his inaugural address. So that stayed with me when I entered college. I had President Kennedy's inaugural address floating through my head for the 4 years I was there. Meanwhile, Stokely Carmichael was in my class. You know, Howard was the hotbed of the movement. You know, I even did 1 or 2 little sit-ins down in Woolworth, down in Virginia. And, you know, and Stokely would come in from Mississippi, and we took a philosophy of art class together, 6 of us talking about Picasso's Cubist period or whatever, you know. But I always knew, I mean, I had a sense about the injustice that was going on in this country. And I always knew I wanted to be a lawyer. I had known that since the age of 7 or 8 years old, that I wanted to be a lawyer. But I also knew something else. Here I was 17, and I realized when I went away to school that my environment was limited. I had only interacted with African Americans. You know, and although they were wonderful people, that was not the world. That was not enough. And as I said, I came out of a segregated environment. Somewhere in my spirit, I knew I had to engage with the larger world, with the community. So when I graduated college, I realized I was not seasoned enough to begin a law school career. I didn't know enough. You know, so I didn't even apply. I said, I'm not. I said, I need to travel. I need to see something about the world. And I don't want to go to Africa because I'll do Africa on my own one day when I have money. I will do Africa. That will be done. But I want to do something else. So I could choose. And I said, Turkey. Because I knew the least about it, and that's always been a philosophy of mine. Go somewhere different, that you know very little about the subject matter of the people, and immerse yourself in a learning experience. And I said, Turkey will provide it. And did it. Did it. So I taught English as a foreign language. It's called TEFL, in Ankara. At Hacettepe, which is the medical school. And Turkish is a relatively new language, 1935, Ataturk, the father of Turkey, you know, with the language. And so the textbooks for medical students were written either in German or English. So the students had to be proficient in one of those languages before they could continue a medical career. And so enter Elaine. And I knew they were listening, Stan. I felt you know how we taught TEFL, you know, I went to the store, and you put in a noun, you know, and, you know, I went to the went to the theater, and then you put in a verb, the different tense. I am going to the theater. That's the way you. And pretty soon, I heard my students not only putting the word in the right place, but they were mimicking this accent. Poor thing. Somewhere there are Turkish doctors, who sound like me all over the country. But it was. We'll talk about it more. But it was a tremendous 2 years. I mean, they had never seen African Americans, and so they argued with me that I was American. I would say America. No. And I said, well, whatever, Arab. No love lost between the Turks and the Arabs. And Arab. And, so I had some difficult moments. But once I got immersed in the community and had these dinners with my students and their families and traveled all over the country, I really grew up in Turkey. And not only with the Turks, but with my fellow volunteers. My fellow volunteers were predominantly white, young white men and women, and it was our first interaction with one another, and that was wonderful because we had many of the same experiences. And so we'll talk more about it later, but it was a terrific experience.
Thank you, Lee. Now, Sarah, Morocco, 1984.
So here we've got the 60s and the incredible energy and vibrancy of that period that was just projecting Americans out all over the place. So I'm graduating in 1984, which was your, financial. I went through a list of what all of my classmates did, and it became difficult to find ones who didn't go into either real estate or financial management. So it was so extraordinary that someone in my class actually joined the Peace Corps that, at graduation when they, mention a couple of the really weird things that people are doing, out came, some of you are joining the Peace Corps. So that was a very different environment. And I would say, to answer your second question first, not really satisfied with how I did. And what's an interesting subtext, so I was an English teacher also in a village in Morocco. What's an interesting subtext that I hear here is, while ostensibly the Peace Corps is about how we're going to go off and help other people, I think it's pretty obvious to all of you by now that what the Peace Corps really does is help us. And what I can say, so I've spent the last 10 years practically of my life living in living in downtown Kandahar, Afghanistan, which I think you may have been reading about in the last couple of months. And it wasn't until sort of recently that I realized I'm doing the Peace Corps. I mean, the way I function in Afghanistan, I speak Pashto, I live with people, I go to their funerals, which in Afghanistan is significantly different prospect than in the Dominican Republic or perhaps even Turkey. I mean, I'm going, the funeral of a good friend of mine in 2005 in a village up in the mountains. I'm the only foreigner and the only female. Being female in that environment, and the way I would do it is actually camouflage, meaning I cross-dress. Now, the idea isn't that I'm cross-dressing. The idea is, how do I look like what people expect to see? So if I'm driving my little yellow taxi around Kandahar, they expect to see a man driving the taxi. So I got my turban on and things like that. All of that, but I realized after the fact, is the training that I got in the Peace Corps. And so what I would say is that it's not that easy crossing the boundaries that we've all, first of all, our temperaments drew us to cross, but we got incredible training in it. It's not something that you may have a draw to it, but it's not something that actually comes naturally. And so what I would say is, through a number of iterations, I got to the point where I could actually make a contribution, not only in Afghanistan, but again in terms of the United States. So we were just talking about public service and things like that. where I also work, apart from my soap factory in downtown Kandahar, I also work as a special advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So it's a little bit amusing that the largest organization dedicated to waging war needed to reach out to a Peace Corps volunteer for what the skill set that the Peace Corps provided me, being able to bring that into an institution that is not so well versed in interacting with local populations.
Thank you. Joe, Dominican Republic, 2004.
Yeah, so I was in the Dominican Republic from 2004 to 2006. I had graduated college in 2003, and I had no idea what to do after that. And so I talked to friends, I talked to family, I talked to professors, I talked to colleagues, and a lot of my classmates were going off to Wall Street doing management consulting or iBanking or whatever else, and I didn't feel like I wanted to do that. I wasn't ready for a desk job. I wanted to go out and see the world. I wanted to experience something, do something that was very much on my own, and I wanted to figure out if there was a way. I'd obviously been very, very fortunate if there was a way that I could give back in some way. And when I kind of made that list out over and over and over again, people kind of said, well, this kind of seems like a Peace Corps idea. And ended up on a plane about 8 months later. And I remember extremely vividly, we left Logan and then we went to a staging down in Miami for a couple days. And I remember so clearly the wheels lifting off from Miami and then touching down in the Dominican Republic and going, oh my God, what have you done? And I spoke broken Spanish when I got there. I don't know a soul, never been to the country. And the only thing that I knew was that it was going to be different from what I expected. And it definitely was that. So I ended up, I think all of us would probably say, you end up doing a whole bunch of different things throughout the course of your Peace Corps career. It's extremely entrepreneurial. Part of your actual service is they tell you kind of what you're going to do, and then they're very open about the fact that for most volunteers, after you get to where you're supposed to go, part of your time is to figure out what you're actually going to do, just because they don't know. And there's a lot of freedom in that, and I think a lot of the strength of the organization is in that. So I ended up working with and living with a group of guys that were between the age of 18 and 30 years old, Dominican men that were guides of this unbelievably beautiful series of waterfalls that form natural water slides and cliff jumps. It was about 45 minutes from a middle-class tourist destination. And when I arrived, there were about 50,000 tourists that were going there every year. These guides would end up literally swimming across these holes, taking people on their backs, climbing up these rock walls, and doing this incredibly intensive physical labor. The tour companies were charging people between $40, $50, up to $80 or $100, even $100 a person, and would only guarantee the guides roughly 10 or 12 cents per person. And yeah, it was terrible. But the area was a national park, although nobody knew it, and the environmental ministry was bankrupt, didn't have any money. So working with the guides, went around and raised some money from the UN and USAID, and then went back to the government and said, hey, you guys this is a beautiful resource, it's getting exploited. If you give us the management rights, we can probably clean it up a little bit. And he said, well, you guys don't have any money. And I went, well, you give us the legal rights, we'll get the money. And they said, if we get the money, you give us the legal rights. So sign. And they did. So we ended up creating this contract that allowed the guides to manage this park. It gave them a per-person entrance fee. Part of it went to increase their own salaries. Part of it went to form a cooperative for healthcare and education and that kind of stuff. And part of it went to a environmental preservation fund, and then part of it went to a community fund where $1 for every tourist that went in there got directly invested in the community. So they bought a school bus and built a little police station, scholarship fund, basketball courts, put in potable water to a couple hundred homes, and they have that on a renewable basis every year. And it's still going, which I think is a pretty cool thing. In terms of your question about was I successful, I keep in touch with those guys about once a week now. I've gone back a couple times. It's still very much a big part of my life. I think probably the best thing that I would ever could do for them was one night, every now and again, we would have these cookouts down by the river. And I had snuck off to Puerto Plata, which was about an hour or so by local transportation away, which is the next kind of the closest city. And it took me all day, but I was able to find a bag of marshmallows and chocolate bars and graham crackers. And the look on their face when I went around asking them for, there's this huge bonfire, and I asked them for a stick. And they went, "What are you doing? This is a crazy white man trying to do." And I put this white thing on the end of it. I'd never seen a marshmallow. And I threw it in the fire. And they said I had just gone crazy. And then I took it out of the fire. It was flaming. And I threw some chocolate on it, put it between 2 graham crackers, and then took a bite out of it. And they, thought I was absolutely nuts. And I've got pictures up on my wall of about 10 Dominican guys with marshmallows all over their face. And they thought it was the greatest thing I ever did in their lives. So, s'mores might be the greatest thing I've ever come up with.
Sounds like American imperialism.
There you go. But I did want to say just one other quick story. One of the most poignant moments I had there was I was in the back of a guagua, which was basically a huge minivan that was meant for, in the States, 8, and there's about 35 people crammed in the thing. And I'm in the second to last row going into Santo Domingo. And I get a tap on the shoulder. And I turned around, didn't recognize the guy, and he's just a middle-aged Dominican. He just said, "Guapa de Paz, Peace Corps." And I said, "See." And he went on to tell me that he had lived on the outskirts of Santo Domingo 20 or 30 years before. And that when he was a young boy, somebody from the Peace Corps had been sent to their community and had built an aqueduct to bring potable water to their village. And that one act enabled the villagers, to the women and the children, to stop trekking hours and hours a day to bring water to their homes. He never asked my name. He never asked what I did. He never asked where I lived. He just said, "I want to thank you for everything that man did for our family and for my village." And a couple minutes later, he got off the bus. I never saw him again. And I think there's probably thousands and thousands of volunteers over decades and generations that have similar stories like that. And I think that's one of the key things to remember about this organization.
Thank you. I wonder if we can explore a little bit. Sarah was saying that the volunteer takes much more back than the volunteer gives. And that brings up a subject, although you didn't say it, that do people feel, people on the panel feel, that the Peace Corps doesn't do that much good? Is it a limited contribution, or is it a great contribution? Is the importance of the Peace Corps, what we take back? I don't know if anybody wants to. I mean, you didn't say that exactly. But
No. What I was suggesting is that the Peace Corps became the backbone of the teaching profession in Malawi. Right. That the best teachers, the most teachers, the teachers who would go into the bush. I remember a Malawian saying to me, I said, "When I leave, you can take my job." He said, No. You Americans love you love the bundu. You love the bush." He said, "You go to the bush. I want to stay in the city, and or do something else." In other words, we were so successful, I think, as teachers, that we displaced the teachers, or became the backbone of that. Most of the successful teachers and the Peace Corps schools were staffed by Peace Corps. Most of the government ministers, if not the Prime Minister and President of Malawi, were trained by, they're now at the age where they were all trained by Peace Corps. Museveni in Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, who's been in power for 25 years, was a student of mine in Uganda. So, I mean, he's running for an unprecedented 5th term, so he won't leave. But we were very successful, so successful that Malawians didn't want to be teachers.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's sort of an aside, but in Ethiopia, in the 60s, Harris Wofford, who was the director then, persuaded the university to force each university student to spend at least 1 year teaching in the bush like the volunteers did, which was in a sense, a tremendous success. but that also persuaded them that the country was so bad that they ought to rebel against Haile Selassie. But it was an interesting way of spreading the Peace Corps idea. Okay, but does anybody else want to talk about that?
I think that the individuals, I think it's something that Peace Corps, there's three goals, right, in terms of actually contributing substantively to some sort of development problem, whether it's some, education or water and sanitation or healthcare, whatever it is, HIV/AIDS, economic development, youth programs. So you've got specific sectors that Peace Corps substantively tries to attack in working with the host governments. Then you've got this cultural exchange in terms of trying to increase host countries' understanding of Americans and Americans' understanding of the people in the host countries. Undoubtedly, I think every Peace Corps volunteer takes away so much from that experience. And I don't know if you can, I know personally there's not a day that goes by, even now working as a prosecutor, that I don't draw on some level, my 2.5 years in the Dominican Republic. So I could never try to minimize what I took away from that time. At the same time, I do come back to that story that I just shared, where a stranger that you never met and you will never see again thanks you for something else somebody did 30 years before. And I don't know how many other professions have that. I don't know how many other bankers where people come up and say, thank you so much, the teller that you had 30 years ago really changed my life. Right? It is something where you make an impact, or you can make an impact that isn't necessarily felt until 20 or 30 years later.
But let me move us to another subject, because I'm just curious how U.S. foreign policy affected your lives. Paul and Elaine were there during the Vietnam War. You were there during all Reagan's activities in Central America, and you were there for the Iraq War. Did these subjects? Well, I know Vietnam came up with you. I know.
Yeah, constantly. Yeah.
Did it come up in Turkey?
Well, the Turks were mad over Cyprus. I mean, they were not happy with us. With that between Greece and Greece and Turkey, and the case of Cyprus. So that was an issue there. But I think the most important thing, I mean, if we are able to contribute in terms of some substantive skills, that are picked up, fine. But I think it's the cultural exchange, it's the one-on-one interaction with individual Turks that make the difference over the course of time. I mean, they get to know you and you get to know them, and you take that with you, and I really agree that we as volunteers get much more from our host country than we give.
Elaine, when you were talking about one-on-one, don't you agree that we weren't there as powerful people? We were there as simple folk.
That's right.
And there's a big difference between being a diplomat in Africa or on Turkey and just being a simple soul in a little hut in a small village.
That's
that
right.
You have no power. We had no power.
That's right.
I had no power. I'm sure you had
none.
none. There's quite a big difference between meeting people as just. And in fact, we were less than because of you speak the language less well.
And what that does, it strengthens us because when I came back, I went to University of Virginia Law School. They hadn't had women, had 5 white women and me in my class, and they hadn't had women and African Americans. And I was the first black woman that they had ever met matriculated at Mr. Jefferson's University. And so when I got to Charlottesville, that was quite an environment for me back in 1967. You know, and I looked around Charlottesville and I said to myself, all right, law school. I said, you know, if you think that I'm somehow going to leave here without a degree, I got news for you. Because I have just come from Turkey. So, Charlottesville, you will be a piece of cake. That's right. And it brought me back 20 years later and gave me Mr. Jefferson's medal, the Medal of Honor.
Well, in that case, it did change your life.
Oh.
Does everyone agree with that? Because that's I often don't know whether it's a cliche or a fact, but on these radio programs I've been on the last few weeks, there are a lot of people call up and say, Peace Corps changed my life. And I just wonder, did it change your life, Sarah?
I can't tell if it changed it or it reinforced it, you know? So it's the nature and nurture thing. Did it help me be what, you know, the inside part of me really wanted to be? Or did it veer me off in a direction? In terms of subject matter, I mean, I came back from Morocco. Then I went back to graduate school in history, studying medieval Islam, right? The transmission of scientific knowledge in medieval Islam. Oh my God, I don't even know how I was smart enough to even devise the title of that topic back then. And I actually bailed out of that and went into journalism, and I said, I am never going near Islam again as long as I live. And well, you know, 10 years in Afghanistan later, and so again, it's very hard to know. You go and do this. All of us, I think, did this very young. So it's sort of like getting married when you're 18 years old. Do you grow into that relationship, or did you choose the person that you marry, or did you choose this path because that's who you are?
What about you, Joe? Because your life isn't as long as some of the others. Did it change your life, you think?
I would actually kind of echo just what you said, is that it's, I think, as I said, not a day goes by where I don't draw on some experience that I had, or I don't find myself impacted in some way from it. And that's on top of just the language skills of being able to speak Spanish. But whether or not it's a life-altering decision or impact, or if it's just kind of clarifies that that's what you want to do, I mean, I think that that's open for debate. I think one of the really interesting dynamics with the Peace Corps is the debate between focusing on young people and focusing on who are full of idealism and can kind of take those experiences and carry that with them for the rest of their lives, and see how many of those end up being teachers or working in government or being in the Foreign Service or USAID or in the nonprofit world at some level. But when you get down and you get dropped off in the Dominican Republic and you're 23 years old, you don't really know what the heck to do, right? But people who do get there was a couple groups or a couple individuals in my Peace Corps group who were 50 years old, had run successful businesses, and came there and worked almost as consultants for nonprofits. And the impact that they could have to run those businesses was tremendous. The lessons, then again, that they took with them for the rest of their lives, their professional careers were going to be much shorter on the back end than mine. So there's a trade-off on both sides.
And I think, Stan, when you're young, though, and you're going into the Peace Corps, the thread that undergirds all of this, when you're young, and the earlier you get this message, the better, that you appreciate and value difference.
Yeah.
You value it. It's not something to criticize or ridicule or become judgmental about. It's something to learn from. And when you really absorb that lesson, and you have that lesson early in life, then it affects how you go through life and how you interact with others. And it makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah, I was going to. I was going to say that yes, it's a life-changing experience, because in the post that I was in a minority. I was just one person in the bush. I couldn't have been more conspicuous or more powerless. I come from a family of 7 children in Medford, And I was liberated by the Peace Corps. I suddenly had a place of my own, even though it was a hut in the bush. I had my own room. It happened to be in Central Africa, but also you learn to negotiate with people. You learn to get along with them. You speak their language. You need to be. You really have no power as a minority of one in a small village in the middle of Africa or wherever it is in Dominican Republic. And you realize that you can't force people to do things. You need to negotiate, talk, make friends, be affable, and that's a great lesson. It teaches you humility. You are no one. You are so small. And when you leave the Peace Corps, realize that the world is something that requires compromise and negotiation. You can't go in and hit people on the head. One of the problems now is that people think that they can go to countries and change them, so that Africa's in the hands of megalomaniacs. But not all the megalomaniacs are in power. Many of them are just people who try to, people, you too, I don't know, Angelina Jolie, people who parachute in and try to change things. That's not the way to do it. You'd send those people for 2 years in a village without a cell phone. I didn't make a phone call for 2 years. Changed my life.
I didn't have a piece of chicken for 2 years.
Let me change the subject. Let me throw out a question that's a staff question. Was the staff of any use to you? The Peace Corps staff, the people we put overseas to help the volunteers.
I annoyed the out of my poor, the guy that was in charge of my sector. Literally, we actually had cell phones. The Dominican Republic was one of the places that was developed enough where we could have a cell phone. And I ended up trying to start to run a business. I had no idea what the heck I was doing. So I called him all the time. I ended up writing these big grants. One of my most memorable moments was I had to pull an all-nighter, which is very difficult to do, to write the grant in Spanish on the computer when there's no power. So I had gone and I charged up the computer and then an extra battery and then a generator. And I got an extra gallon of gasoline. And at 4 in the morning, I was just going on the generator. And everything else was done. And I had a headlamp on because there was no electricity. And there's bugs flying in your eyes and bugs covering the computer screen. And I had to call the guy the next day and have him proofread the thing because my Spanish was still, I had no idea what the heck I was writing. I was hoping that they would try to figure it out. But I leaned on them constantly.
Oh, you did.
And they were fantastic.
Is that true?
No, I mean, I knew where the Peace Corps office was, and that was solid. But I only showed up when there was some physical exam I had to take, or I needed them for something, which was rare, I thought. I mean, I just didn't, they were there as a support system, and when I needed support, I reached for it, and it was there. And so that was very, very important. But it wasn't a daily or weekly. I mean, I would go a month without seeing the Peace Corps office. So, I'm glad they were there.
I'm just curious.
No cell phones in Morocco.
Right.
Two things. One, if anyone from the embassy shows up in your village, you're not required to talk to them. That was a very good instruction. The other one was, so I run, and girls don't run in countries like Morocco, and I was also our village was kind of wedged into a mountainside. 20 minutes is okay. 20 minutes before dawn. So the nurse, I guess, it was like, they say that you're supposed to do more than 20 minutes of aerobics. If you get 20 minutes in, that counts.
So the staff was all right? Okay, so you have the his then.
Yeah, I had the same experience, which is the Peace Corps was a bureaucracy that really didn't understand what the volunteers did, and that So a great deal was due to the initiative of the individual volunteer. It was one of the great things about it. So I don't know whether they really didn't have a clue about what we were doing. They knew where we were, but occasionally someone from the Peace Corps someone from Washington would come to my school. They'd come in a Land Rover, and they'd come and they'd say, "Great little school, great little country, you're doing a great job." And then they'd leave, and I remember that we were at the end of a dusty road, and they'd leave, "See you later." They'd be going back to the Capitol, and the dust would be settling. They would go, vroom, the Land Rover would leave, and then the dust would settle, and suddenly it would get very, very quiet. Another 3 months would pass. But it was the great thing about the Peace Corps, which is that they didn't micromanage. They left it to your initiative, and they let you grow up. And we, to a very large extent, grew up in the Peace Corps without someone breathing down our neck. And I think that was a wonderful thing. So I felt they were inefficient and bureaucratic, but they were also far away.
I loved it.
Well, I was wondering if we should go into the audience questions now.
Yeah.
Now, how do we just to work it that way?
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Roy Freed. I live in Canton. I'm a retired lawyer, and I'm here as a volunteer Peace Corps person to speak to the older people in the audience about opportunities to service. My wife and I, at age 72, were fortunate to be Fulbright teachers in Bulgaria in 1989. And I'm here to tell the older people here to be aware, and even the younger people too, to be aware of the Fulbright program, which is a parallel to the Peace Corps, much older. It was started in 1946 by Senator Fulbright to soak up the money that foreign countries owed the United States for help during the Second World War. And we were teachers. My wife was a teacher of clinical social work in Bulgaria during communism.
Wow.
And she introduced psychodynamic psychology into a communist area. And it was a fabulous experience. People just took advantage of it. It was amazing. And I was teaching law. Fortunately, my opportunity to teach at the university didn't work out. And I had the opportunity to teach directly to people in the computer industry about legal aspects of computer technology, and I discovered how sophisticated they were, and they got an awful lot of us. And through this opportunity, my wife and I have created a large family of supportive Bulgarians, both in Bulgaria and here in Boston. There are large numbers of immigrants, and through the email, we have a gigantic supportive family. And we've made, I believe, from our experience, a great contribution there. And I recommend that you be aware of that as well as the Peace Corps. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Walter Carrington.
Hi, Walter.
Stan Howard. Good to see you. It's been a long time. Yes. I'm going to take the brave position and defend the overseas staff. Since I was one of the original 7 overseas directors that Shriver appointed, and our group, our group from Sierra Leone, was the 3rd to go into the field back when the Peace Corps first started. But what I really want to say is that while it is true that that volunteers got a hell of a lot out of the Peace Corps, and as a result, the United States got a lot out of it. And I think of my own Sierra Leone group. During the time when Sierra Leone was undergoing its terrible civil war, the most outspoken advocates for a strong policy to support the people who were against the violence that was going there were our returned volunteers, who, when they came back, were extremely active in the work that they did. on behalf of the countries in which they served. And I had a chance to see them close up and personal in 3 countries, directing programs first in Sierra Leone, then in Tunisia, and then in Senegal, and returning to become director for Africa for the Peace Corps. So I was able to see what they did. For example, in Sierra Leone, while they taught and they helped to provide training for teachers, they also gave the government of Sierra Leone the opportunity that they would not have had, I think, without the Peace Corps, to right after becoming independent, because we arrived there a few months after their independence, to set up schools in the interior. Up until that time, almost all the schools were religious schools that were run by either the Protestants or Catholic missions. The Peace Corps was able to help the government to broaden its educational system, and so it ended up with one of the best secondary educational systems in Africa, and I think that was directly a result of what the Peace Corps did. And I think you can find these stories in a number of other places. In Tunisia, we had architects who went out. If they had been back here in the States, they would have been draftsmen. In Tunisia, they were able to build all kinds of things that they never would have an opportunity. It would take them 10 years to do here. So that I think that we must remember what the Peace Corps did. And one last thing I will say about the Peace Corps is that in terms of integration, remember in 1961, Washington was a very segregated city. The government itself, the opportunities for blacks were extremely limited. The Peace Corps provided opportunities for blacks in the staff that were so great that the State Department would often try to use the Peace Corps figures to take them and pretend that they were State Department figures to show the State Department was integrated. Some of the top positions in the Peace Corps were held by African Americans. And I think that was an extremely important contribution that Sarge Shriver made to the Peace Corps and the way in which it developed. So I'm happy to be here to say a word on behalf of the staff guys who served.
Thank you. Walter didn't fully identify himself because he's one of our most esteemed ambassadors to Nigeria and I believe Senegal. Is that right? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Steve Mutt, and I'm also from here. I volunteered and served in Nepal in 66, 67, and 68. It was done on a flat part, not up in the mountains. And we did an agricultural development project, part of the Green Revolution that came out of the Philippines. Extraordinarily successful. So I did my 2.5 years there and trained a group that came in after me, came home, taught for 30 years. Last October we went back. So we hiked up to Everest because I'd never seen that, and that was very cool. But then I'd put in a little extra trip down to try to visit my village again. So we fly down, which I couldn't do before. Couple hours out into the jungle in a little car, find the village, and it's all different. No more mud huts, no more thatch roofs. They're wooden houses, they're tile roofs. I bumped into a couple of kids and say who I am. They don't know. Their parents weren't born when I was there. So I'm showing pictures of people that I knew. And no, dead. We don't know who he is. So I said, what the hell, we'll go. But let's just walk around the village for a minute or two, and at least I could show my wife and my son where I was. I stepped around the car. Guy came out of the corner and said, it's Steve. It was like unbelievable. It was so mystical. After 45 years that we would recognize each other. So 2 or 3 of the guys came over. We chatted for a couple of hours. It was just unbelievable. They're still growing the same improved rice, the same improved wheat, and the village is clearly way more prosperous than it ever was. They got a real tractor. So as far as I was concerned, I personally got an amazing amount of stuff out of it. So did the village. So.
Good evening. My name is Susan Camp, and it's funny because I remember going to my first Peace Corps meeting when I was in college. Actually, the only part of it that I remember was when they began talking about the lack of hot showers. And then I remember looking for the exits, and that was the end of the meeting for me. But life goes full circle. And now I'm here with my daughter, who has expressed interest. In fact, wanted to go last year on a service trip to Colombia. We butted heads over that, and I won that one, but I'm not going to continue to win. I think she's pretty adamant about wanting to do something along these lines. My question or request, I guess, of all of you is that as a parent, what can you say to parents of young people who in this day and age are expressing interest to go overseas when being an American in some of these countries is not a good thing? Part of me, of course, I don't want to squelch her desires, but there's part of me that says, why can't you stay in our country and help people here? Why do I have to send you to a place that is going to be hostile to Americans, even those coming with humanitarian desires to help? I'm glad I came tonight. I don't think that this meeting had the same effect on her as the one that I attended had on me, but it's wonderful work. But again, as a parent, I would say the same thing of my son, who I believe is going to end up in the service. Of course, I don't want to say no, but it's a scary thing to let your children go off with wonderful intentions and feeling as if they're not going to be received in the manner in which they're being offered.
Well, so Joe, you were the most recent. I thought you might. How hostile were people in Dominican Republic?
I had the time of my life, right? It wasn't to say that it was all fun and games at a party, right? It was hard work. There's definitely a lot of challenges to it. But the safety issue is something that Peace Corps takes. It really is the number one priority. And when you arrive there, you go through, people will say that the full service term is 27 months, because there's a 3-month training period first where you're with other volunteers, and they go through extensive amounts of how to, not only the cultural cues, but the language, how to stay safe, how to be safe. They also prep not only where you're training, but the place where you're actually sent to, your permanent site. That's the job of the host country personnel, is to make sure that that site is ready to receive a volunteer. And what they invest so much time in attempting to make sure that site is ready. And it's also why the first several months that you're actually at that site, that they give you lots of instructions on how to build up those relationships with people around you. For the crime that does happen, I don't have the statistics on me, but I do remember from being there, the vast majority of time where Peace Corps volunteers fall victim to crime, it's not in your site. It's when you're traveling elsewhere throughout the country. Part of that, though, is also they do teach you, you're in places that are where oftentimes what you might have in your wallet now is what somebody makes in a month. You don't carry around $500 in cash, right? You dress with the same cultural cues as the people that you are living with and you're surrounded with. And all of a sudden, even when you're in the middle of Africa in a mud hut, you are, I don't know if you felt this way, but you're a member of that community. It's home. And there's a transition time that it takes until that happens, but after a certain point, it's home. And when it's home, walk down the street in Boston.
And then if you're going to travel around the country, you don't do it alone. I mean, it's judgment, too, you have to exercise. But then the question that you asked, though, is a very serious one. I mean, my poor mother, God rest her soul, every time there was an earthquake in Turkey, my sister tells me Mother had a wake for me, and then all the neighbors came. Every time, because we couldn't communicate. This is 1966. Yeah. And so, she got through it. She got through it, and I came back. But I do hear your concerns, and the concerns any parent would have, regardless of wherever their children are. I mean, it's just a parental concern. You care about what's going on with them, and you don't see them, and they're not with you under your protective. And I can't answer that. I can't remove that from you. But when they go abroad, especially with an umbrella like the Peace Corps and institution, the Peace Corps is very concerned. That's their number one priority, our safety. And they teach us about that, and they tell us how to use good judgment, and it's in your interest. If they accept you, you've got some judgment. That's one of the things they evaluate you on. But this is a very individual decision, and I wish you well.
Sarah would like to add.
It's funny, too, because having heard what so many of you did in your time over there as teachers, I'm currently an unemployed English teacher, so maybe I'll join up and I can go keep an eye on.
Sarah, do you want to add?
Just to pile in with Elaine, I think what you're going through is what mothers go through. That's right. And again, let's have the mothers competition. The one who's sitting right there, 10 years in Kandahar. I mean, like if you want an environment that is objectively thought to be, hostile to Americans. So 2 points. One is that people respond to people. Wherever you are, people respond to people. So you asked about, U.S. foreign policy. Again, I'm living in a place where the United States is waging war, where I'm at. And it's astonishing to me the degree to which I'm not held responsible for that. And the other point is the service. And I don't want to denigrate risk, but Sebastian Younger, who has also given a couple of forums here, is my oldest friend and just wrote a book called War, in which he, and there's a documentary attached to it, in which he examined the life of young grunts, right? And one of the things he found out that I'm not sure he actually put in the book was when he checked casualty figures, it turns out that soldiers are safer, with the exception of the ones who are all the way out in the incredibly rare outposts that are in combat every single day, like the one that he embedded in. If you take the American male 18 to 25-year-old age range, the people who the ones who are the safest are the ones in the military and the police and fire departments, because of the kind of structuring and stuff like that. And so what I've gone through, and it's an issue that I think about every day myself, my own safety.
That's right.
And I find that we tend to get very emotional about risk, actually. That risk is, I don't want to use the word irrational as a pejorative thing, but what I mean is 65,000 Americans a year die in automobile accidents. But my mother goes through the wake, more or less, once a week, because I'm in Kandahar. And so what I discipline myself to do, and what I would urge you to discipline yourself to do, is get coldly rational about risk. And that doesn't mean that I, don't think about it, but it means that I've examined with some depth what are the risk factors for me. And they turn out to be quite counterintuitive. I actually have discovered that one of the things that keeps me safe is the fact that I'm American, because a lot of people in Kandahar just sort of presume that I've got a predator, I mean, so it took a lot of thought to get there. And as I said, I just reinforce what Elaine said. This is motherhood.
Can I add to that? Is that you said that there's a lot of countries that don't like Americans. This is what the Peace Corps volunteers is. A country isn't its leadership. It's not its government. It's its people. Yeah. So if your daughter joins the Peace Corps, she's going to be among people to negotiate with, speak their language, and it's going to be. You can find out that a country is not represented necessarily by its government. The government might be hostile. Zimbabwe, as an example, hates Robert Mugabe. But people Zimbabwe is on the list of the most dangerous places in the world. Some of the most interesting times and safest times I've had have been in Zimbabwe and not even that long ago.
Yeah, me too.
So you're talking to people that when you join the Peace Corps, you realize that you have a common destiny on earth, and that you're talking to people that we have a tremendous amount in common with them. And one of the things which might help is that maybe your daughter should leave home. I told my father that I was joining the Peace Corps and I was going to be away for 2 years. He said, "Great, great." He said, "You're lucky." He felt I was really lucky. My mother had mixed feelings, of course, but he thought, "Great." I was liberated. But then you find out that you're talking to people, person to person, and that you're facing unemployment, hunger, disease, whatever it is, literacy, looking for a job. That if the whole world is like that, except that the world is poor. Most of the world has much less than we have. And when you go there, you realize that also that there's a great deal in common. That's what you find. That's what the Peace Corps teaches you. It's not what soldiers are taught. Soldiers are taught a different lesson: to take orders and to do it, whatever they're told to do, including to send predators. So, I mean, joining the Peace Corps is quite different from joining the service.
And once your community, your village, or your little town, or wherever you are, once they embrace you, they claim you. When they embrace you, they look out for you. Yeah. See, and it takes them a little while to adjust to you because you are different. And they've got to make sure you're not a threat and what you're all about. And, and they get that within a couple of 6 weeks, couple of months. They're clear. But then when they embrace you, you're different, but you are ours. You're ours. And so it's up to us to protect you, to make sure you're all right. And they're looking when you don't know they're looking. So that's safety there in your community.
Yeah, I'm probably the perfect person to follow the last speaker. My name's Helen Raisin. I'm the proud mother of a current volunteer in Rwanda who just passed the 1-year mark. She's in the third group of the reawakening of the Peace Corps in Rwanda, which was closed in 1993 and reopened in 2009. And one thing I wanted to say is I'm so lucky to be the mother of a Peace Corps volunteer now because I think cell phones are now everywhere. Email is everywhere. We sometimes talk to her on Skype when she can get someplace where there's really good internet access. But we're in regular communication, which is really good because the U.S. has started to refuse mail from Rwanda for the last 3 months or so. So, we would have been really in a horrible situation if it was the conditions without cell phone communication. So we visited her in Rwanda in January and stayed in her village with her for 3 days, and we're very welcome there. And of course, we were kind of an oddity. There were 4 of us, her and 3 of us, all white in this village in Rwanda. But the kids, couldn't wait to see us, to escort us through the village, to run ahead and tell my daughter's friend that we were coming. And it was a lovely experience. And I wanted to say something, because I heard you on the radio yesterday, about there was some question about whether countries really cared about the Peace Corps being there. And I can't speak for anything other than Rwanda, but I can tell you that in Rwanda, when Peace Corps volunteers are sworn in, it's televised nationally. And when my daughter went to the bank the next day and spoke Kinyarwanda at the bank, they recognized her from the TV and started to, it was like she was almost like a celebrity. And by the way, as we went around Rwanda with her and she spoke Kinyarwanda, even though it's a very difficult language and her grammar's it's one of the hardest grammars in the world, and her grammar's still not very good, even though she rewrote the grammar for the Peace Corps training booklet. But people would turn to her and say, "You're Rwandan," because she was speaking the language. I mean, it doesn't matter that she's white and she has, had a background which is much more comfortable than most people living in Rwanda. She lives as a Rwandan now. She lives at their salary, or the salary of, maybe a middle-class person. She doesn't have the kind of money that a lot of whites in Rwanda who are there with NGOs have. And she's accepted as a Rwandan because she speaks the language and because she's there to give service. So you can find me afterwards if you want to ask more questions. But I think being the parent of a Peace Corps volunteer today is a lot easier than it was in the past because we have global communication, and it's just a wonderful thing, and it should go on for at least another 50 years.
Okay.
If we can recall back to before the question period, when the panelists were going through their final relation of their experiences, it seemed to me that the issue of support from the next echelon of Peace Corps people in the areas varied from almost none from the early days to something significantly better here. And I want to know if I read that correctly, and if so, what the implications are. This is of interest to me because my wife Hildred and I have a granddaughter living in a mud hut in Zambia right now in her second year with the Peace Corps. And we communicate with her on Sunday mornings. She climbs onto her bicycle and rides 5 miles and then climbs a mountain so she can get reception to her cell phone or Skype, and then comes back again. So she's working hard at it, and we're proud she's there.
I looked into this a bit. I don't really see much difference because I felt at the beginning that I feel that they put more staff people or more Americans as staff than they do now. But they also have augmented this with local people who are hired to become Peace Corps staff. I'm sure there was a Dominican Republic as well.
Yeah.
And I think, and it often depends on what a volunteer will tell you as to whether there was support. But I don't see much differences, in fact, with this.
I think that there's obviously the technology makes it a lot easier, but I think it is the main, if there is one main mantra of the Peace Corps, it's what you make it, right? And so if you want to, I leaned on Peace Corps staff a bit because I didn't know what the heck I was doing. There were other people that were very comfortable and just never talked to them, and they didn't need to, and they were fine with that. So they're there. It's easier now to contact them. It was easy for me to because I was in an area that did have a cell phone reception, so I could call. I didn't go into the office all that often, but I didn't have to. So I think for your granddaughter's situation, they're there if you want them to, if she needs them. And there was, for us anyway, a 24-hour medic on call. We had, when we got there, just for the safety issue, we had to map down a place where they could land a Black Hawk helicopter if need be, right? So it was 24/7. There was a safety net if you needed one.
Just for the sake of time, I'm going to ask the last 3 questioners to ask make your comments very brief, and then we'll have a final comment or answers from our panel. So just three. Go ahead.
Great, thanks. My name's Gary Fraden. I was in Chad for a couple years in the mid-'70s. And I came here because it's always fun to spend a couple hours every 10 years or so reminiscing. My question actually is a demographic question to the audience. How many people were in the Peace Corps who are here?
Ooh.
Oh my God.
First, I'd just like to thank you all for sharing your experiences tonight. I just returned from the Peace Corps last fall from Mongolia and loved the experience. Since then, I've given a number of talks to groups around the Boston area and Florida last week. And I always look around the audience, as I would tonight, and say, I don't see anybody here who couldn't apply to the Peace Corps. The oldest person is 86, as I understand. And as Peace Corps people often say, this may be the hardest thing you've ever done, but it will be the best thing you've ever done. I've done a lot of wonderful things, but Peace Corps is certainly a highlight, to the extent that when I left, I didn't want to leave, and I figured out how to develop some projects, so I'm going back next month.
Hi, I was a volunteer in Cameroon in the 80s, and I live in Medford. Hi, Paul. Welcome back. I grew up in Brooklyn in New York, and one of the amazing things was here this white guy from the big city. I got sent to a very, very small village. I was the only foreigner within 60 miles in any direction, and I felt more at home in that spot than I did my whole life up to that point. It's very telling. But one of the questions that I have, I'm going to be brief, is that it was drilled into us. We are working ourselves out of a job. If you do your job right, in a few years there won't be another volunteer. But every time I would get mail from Peace Corps, it would tout, isn't this wonderful, we're expanding our program. It's sort of like two different messages being sent at the same time. How do you guys see that? I mean, are we really trying to work ourselves out of a job, or are we trying to expand our program, or is there somewhere where we meet in the middle?
Well, I can take a try at that because they're almost two different issues. I think they're expanding by adding Peace Corps countries. In fact, the numbers are much smaller than they were in Paul's day. You don't have the large clusters. I mean, besides people like Paul who were in their village alone, there were cities in Ethiopia that had 14 volunteers at the same school, and those volunteers had a far different experience. It was very hard for them to get into any culture beyond teaching, their students, and the rest of the world of Ethiopia is closed to them. So I think now the numbers are much smaller and manageable, and I don't think Peace Corps is sending volunteers into a country just to make the ledger books look good, because they are requested, and so I think they're needed. But the whole problem of why we haven't reached the point of where volunteers are no longer needed raises the whole question of why, after all the money spent in the last 50 years, not in the Peace Corps, but through all foreign aid programs, there is such a high failure rate. I think that, that's almost another question. But in any case, I think Peace Corps isn't pushing more into the same country. It's trying to get into more countries.
I'm sure our panelists would be happy to answer any further questions any of you have. I want to remind you again that Mr. Miser's book is on sale in our bookstore. He'll be signing it out in this hall. Many view this institution as the nation's memorial to John F. Kennedy, but no act better honors his memory and all he stood for than those who, like this extraordinary panel, responded to his call to serve their country. We thank you all so much for coming.